Good morning. I'm Wendy Chamberlain. I'm president of the Middle East Institute, and it gives me very great pleasure to warmly welcome you on this, what's going to be a very warm day today, to the Middle East Institute's Center for Turkish Studies 5th Annual Conference on Turkey. You know, the Middle East Institute inaugurated at this full-day conference focused exclusively on Turkey's internal foreign policy and U.S. relations, because we perceived a great need here in Washington for greater dialogue.
I've never given up on that dream. We know that democracy is a complicated process. We know that it really isn't about absolute rule by a majority. We know that strong legal protections are required against the state, and the state has to enforce those protections against itself. There have to be protections for institutions, academia, judicial, and otherwise. Excuse me. There have to be protections for a free press. That's the way a vibrant democracy works. My friends in Turkey, who are members of the AK Party and who are also members of other parties, all say that they understand that Turkey is on the process to becoming a complete democracy. Americans would like to see Turks taking those steps that bring that day closer for both ambitions. And for myself personally, I think that Turkey has the potential, it has the capability, it has all the talent and skill available to do that, but the impact on the American perception of how Turkey will play in the region is very important. You don't hear Americans talking anymore about Turkey being an example or a model for the region. You don't hear Americans talking anymore, and I'm including official Americans, although it might be contradicted within the hour, talking about the Turkey being a leader in the region or a key stabilizing factor. And so now people are wondering, where is that Turkey they dreamed about? Where is that Turkey they hoped for? And when is that Turkey going to appear? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ambassador Pearson, you raise a lot of very difficult questions about Turkey's place in the region, which perhaps Şaban Kardaş will be able to address. If I could ask you to stick to the 10 minutes, and hopefully we'll be able to get some of the questions from the audience as well to come to you once you're done. We'd like to get as many questions as possible, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Kim. Actually, in the paper you mentioned while introducing me, I was asking a question, and my answer was more or less no. And then I will try to maintain the same line of argument here a little bit. I mean, Gönül asked me to talk about the broader outlines of Turkey's policy vis-à-vis the Middle East, perhaps talking also about the case of Syria and Iraq as they have been unfolding. Especially, I sort of have some disagreements with the way the ambassador accounted the evolution of Turkey's Syria policy. I could come back to it as well. I mean, actually, this is where I think our panel ties to the first one, and one argument made by Ömer and one argument you also made about the relevance of Turkish experience in the Middle East. And this is, I think, a time where that relevance ever becomes more apparent. And this is what Turkey has been trying to accomplish in its own ways. But as Mr. Ambassador also said, Turkey was trying to do many things, but with limited capabilities. Especially this is where I also sometimes raise criticism of Turkey's foreign policy. The question here is what Turkey has been trying to accomplish in the Middle East. And I think the main goal of Turkey in recent years, especially the AK Party, was to create a sort of regional order in which it might play some leadership role. But in order to do so, in order to create a regional order, a functioning regional order, what you need is functioning domestic orders in the constituent parts of that regional order. So you need functioning states, so to speak, in the region. And unfortunately, in the last 10 years, 20 years, we know that in the Middle East, partly because of the mismanaged American interventions, partly because of the region's own dynamics. The key states of the region have been going through difficult times, and right now, in the case of Iraq and Syria, we are observing that they are on the verge of disintegration. So the main objective of Turkey in these Middle Eastern initiatives was to bolster state structures in the region so that the broader regional framework could be more stable, and in that sense Turkey could expand economically and strategically in the region. But the capacity Turkey has to accomplish that objective, this is where we see many challenges, and this is where also we see many disagreements between Turkey and the local actors and Turkey and the international actors, including the United States. For instance, ideally, if Turkey were able to realize its ambitions for such a regional order, it would have to be built on the participation of the key regional actors. So it should be sort of based on regional solutions to regional problems philosophy, where the regional actors are playing the lead role in terms of managing economics, politics, and security affairs. But we know that because of the disagreements in the region among the key actors, but because of also the international actors' policies, Turkey is alone, far from realizing such a regional order. And the case of Syria and recently the case of Iraq again, once again, demonstrated very clearly that in this difficult transition, Turkey directly faces first order the security externalities of this regional vacuum of security governance. And I guess this was what Minister Ala was also referring to. Turkey was the first country to face the externalities from the region, whereas in the West, the effects of what go on there might be felt a little bit later. So this is where I think the experience of Turkey is important. When we talk about Turkey becoming as a potential role model, I think there is a sort of interesting mistake being made in those analyses where we are mostly focusing on democratization as the cornerstone of that model discussion. To me, I have been arguing in my own writings that rather than democratization per se, the key issue here is the state-building process, which we need in the Middle East, and this is where Turkey could share some experience with the region, and this is actually what Turkey has been trying to do in Iraq and in Syria as well. In that sense, the Turkish policy in Syria since the start of the crisis in 2011, and Turkish policy vis-à-vis Iraq, especially since the American invasion. Before the American invasion was always based on this similar understanding that we need to work toward state building, for which we need national reconciliation in Iraq. And if you could remember the events in 2006 in Anbar province, when there was insurgents, Turkey played a very instrumental role in bringing the Sunni tribes into the mainstream. And this is how Americans supported their counterinsurgency with a sort of state-building process. And there was a chance to accomplish it, but unfortunately, the policies pursued by the Maliki government since then, and especially Americans sort of disinterest after the leaving from Iraq expanded that chance very irresponsibly. And this is where I think, for instance, one of the criticisms we used to hear before about Turkish foreign policy, you also raised a similar criticism, whether Turkey has moved from zero problems with neighbors to zero neighbors. This was where I think, again, there was another
zero friends. I think it's still in the region.
There was another misunderstanding in that discussion as well. When Turkey was, for instance, criticizing Maliki, and it was immediately attributed to Turkey acting with a sectarian agenda because we were supporting Hashimi or we were supporting the Kurds. But again, Turkey's point back in those days was to underline the necessity to keep the Sunni groups within the Iraqi mainstream politics. And when we were trying to bolster ties with the Kurds in Iraq through the energy deals, again, the idea was to make them a constituent and capable part of a functioning Iraq, not to undermine the territorial integrity of Iraq. And today we see that the Kurds are seen as, again, sort of a remedy to the security threat, But let's assume that the energy pipeline, the oil pipeline that has been now operational, wasn't there. Would the Kurds have been so much able and willing to stand against the ISIS advance? I think it would have had a different situation. So what I am trying to say is that in the region, Turkey's main vision is based on this state building as a key component of the region building, regional order building. And in the Middle East, unfortunately, the regional order has been going through a tough phase. And it was already mentioned, the debate about the end of Sykes-Picot order in the Middle East. This is up there, and we don't know how it will unfold, but the way I have followed it is the following. I see that in this process, the borders in the region are open for discussion. It doesn't mean disintegration of states, but the borders are becoming ever more irrelevant, and the national states are unable to maintain control over borders and exercise authority over the entire of their country. And we see the rise of multiple non-state and sub-state actors in this process. And most importantly, we lack an effective conflict resolution mechanism that was based on regional actors. But in the same process, we also see the decline of American interest in the region, the decline of international actors. So I have been always arguing for this point. In order to maintain a regional order, you need a mechanism to suppress violence. This is what we miss now. So in this sense, there is a vacuum of security governance, and Turkey on its own is unable to do so. And then the challenge in Syria was more or less about it, and the challenge now also in Iraq are more or less a new reiteration of the same risk. On its own part, since the start of the Arab Spring, Turkey had what I used to call an engagement policy, while most international actors, especially the Americans starting from 2012, preferred a containment policy, trying to stay away from it. But this is where we had a lot of discussions with the Americans, with the West. This was one of the reasons why perhaps we had the discussion about what groups to designate as terrorists, what groups to designate as just opposition fighters, because when you are sitting in the region, you feel the negative effects of the situation much more differently than other international actors. And then Turkey, in the second phase of the Arab Spring, where these security challenges are more obvious, still adopts the active engagement policy. And this is where, again, we see some disagreements between the containment approach of the West. I have been personally, again, arguing that the containment approach is unsustainable because of the spillover effects of Syria. Syria alone, if the entire Syrian society, this infrastructure, the state was disintegrated, it may not have been a big challenge on its own, but the regional implications of Syria, we discussed it, you remember, in 2012 in the autumn, the annual Middle East Institute conference, we discussed the challenge of Syria. Unfortunately, we are experiencing that situation, the regional repercussions, and this is where we see the effect of Syria for Iraq as well. And then Turkey still insists that there should be more active engagement in order to undermine the instability in Syria. And I would like to, I have another minute or so, to come back to Mr. Ambassador's account of the way Turkish foreign policy has in Syria has unfolded, because I personally have followed it while writing different reports and articles on that. And in our classes, we usually say the ambassadors have one weakness. When they are posted to somewhere, they see the things from a native perspective. They see the trees, but perhaps miss the forest. And this is where I think his account of the way Turkish approach has evolved in Syria is a little bit missing some essential parts of the story. And he's right, the Turkish embassy posted in Damascus might have had limited ties and contacts with the opposition from the beginning of the Syrian uprising back in 2011. But outside Syria, Turkey was actually really having deep ties. And then the opposition organized in Turkey, in Istanbul, in March, April 2011 already. And even before Foreign Minister Davutoğlu visited Damascus in August, in April already, the Prime Minister Erdogan sent the Chief of Intelligence Fidan and other officers as sort of go-betweens between the opposition and the regime. And even back then they proposed some reforms. Assad indeed did deliver reforms before the August deal. In May, he announced that other parties could run. He gave some rights to the Kurds. So there was again some Turkish intervention there. But he's right. I agree with his assessment that especially after Ömer Onhun observed the withdrawal, actually it didn't take until September. In 2 days, the deal was broken by Assad himself. The conclusion the Turks drew from that experience was that talking to the Assad and finding a mediated solution was impossible. This was the day when the Turkish approach changed, and increasingly, and since then, and still has been based on Assad leaving the power as a precondition for any political settlement. About the trade as well, the regional impact on Turkey's provinces bordering Syria has been the most visible, but still, from an economic point of view, I was there last 3 weeks ago, and we published a report in my think tank on Syrian refugees as well. Actually, the economic impact could be debated. Right. Now, when you look at the trade figures, because of the international aid assistance flowing to Syria through Turkey, overall we recaptured the trade figures. And in domestic economy, because of the refugees, also because of the flow of Syrian capital out of Syria, you see some flourishing economy. It is not necessarily having a terrible economic impact.
All right. Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you. Thank you for this overview. Thank you to all our speakers. We're going to take questions from the floor now. If you could line up on both sides. There's a microphone on both sides of the room. And while people line up for the questions, I will just start with one myself. If I could ask Ambassador Ford and Mr. Kardash to answer that question. Mr. Ford, do you think that the US is now suddenly going to be engaging Iran in a way that it hadn't before, and what are the implications for the Syria policy? And Şaban, do you think that Turkey's regretting the way it approached Syria and its own red line when it comes to stating that Assad had to go? If I could ask you both to just answer very briefly, and then we can go to questions.
I don't know if we'll have serious conversations with the Iranians about the security situation in Iraq. Our policy heretofore had been not to do that. But I noticed that Secretary Kerry said something which made the headlines of the Washington Post today. So my sense is that this is being studied, and Bill Burns is over in Vienna right now. But I think his trip there is mainly about the nuclear discussions, the nuclear talks. What impact would it have? Not entirely clear to me. The Islamic State is not 10 feet tall, as Judith noted. And my guess is that their advance will be slowed in Iraq as they come into greater and greater contact with, shall we say, better motivated Shia militias. That'll have a whole series of other risks accompanying it, and so any discussions we have with Iran, my guess is will not have much impact on Syria, since we really are diametrically opposed in Syria, so far at least. The real question to me would be, could the Iranians help moderate the behavior of Shia militias as they come into violent contact with Sunni extremists? And there are going to be a lot of civilians in places like Diyala province and west of Baghdad and Tikrit, who are going to be right on that fault line of engagement, and they're going to be in a world of hurt. All right. So all sides are going to need to try to exercise restraint. I honestly do not know a foreign country that has an ability to moderate the behavior of the Islamic State.
All right. And Mr. Kardash, where do you think Turkey stands today when it comes to its Assad policy? Any regrets about how far you've gone in declaring that he should go?
Well, the way I follow it, I don't think you can say regret in terms of calling Assad to leave. I don't see such a regret. But we see the pressures to adjust policy to the new reality. This is the reality of the Syrian situation posing security externalities, and this is where the issues of border security are becoming more pressing. And this is where, for instance, you see greater level of security cooperation with Western partners. In addition to conventional deterrence through NATO, we also see a lot of intelligence sharing with the European agencies about the flow of fighters from Europe and other places, back and forth through the Turkish border, and also bolstering the security precautions along the border through the use of greater technological assistance as well as other forms. But then the issue of governance, to me, this is the key. What is going to be the governance arrangement for the areas that are under the regime control and that are outside the regime control? And as was mentioned, the parts of Syria closer along the Turkish border are controlled largely by different different opposition groups, and also there are the Kurds. Now the challenge in the next stage will be to how to ensure that there is some basic governance being set up. This will be the main challenge.
I think we're still quite far from the time when we can discuss governance, perhaps in Syria. But let's start with questions, please. If you could state your name and affiliation and keep your answers short. Try not to have any statements, please. Go ahead.
Shan, and I am with the Armenian Assembly of America. And my question is for Dr. Kardash regarding regional and economic stability. What is the status of Turkey's land blockade on Armenia, and when do you think it will be lifted? And please talk about the potential of trade with Armenia for Turkey's rural southeastern region.
Go ahead. Dr. Kardash, go ahead.
One by one? Okay, I thought you would collect questions.
Yeah, we'll just do one after the other.
About the Turkish policy on Armenia, as you know, it is a mix of different issues together. On the one hand, the dispute between the Turks and Armenians, which is also because of the policy of the state of Armenia. And on the other hand, there is the issue of the occupied territories of Azerbaijan by Armenia. And the decision to close the border was based on Armenia's occupation of Azeri territories. So it is conditional on the resolution of that dispute. And then the way the two have evolved, they are now interlinked. As you know, in 2008-9, there was a normalization effort between Turkey and Armenia. But because the Armenia-Azerbaijan process did not produce any results, the Turkish normalization process has been also stalled. But in recent months, we see some efforts. The foreign minister visited Armenia, and then the prime minister issued a statement last April, which was sort of expressing some sympathy with the suffering of the Armenians. So with these developments, and we also see a lot of second-track diplomatic initiatives, we see that there are different attempts underway to again re-energize this normalization process. But the implications, some think tanks have carried out studies that if the border could be opened, it will lead to more trade, it will be beneficial. That's obvious. But then I always tell to my Armenian friends that the benefits from opening the border with Armenia will be far less from the broader trade potential Turkey has with Azerbaijan. So you should also look at that side of the story. But then in order to achieve a real benefit from trade and integration from a neo-functionalist perspective, like the European Union example, you have to have a broader regional cooperation, for which you need to solve the Armenia-Azerbaijan dispute as well.
Thank you very much. And we'll take a question from the left, please, if you could introduce yourself.
My name's Justin Weisbrod. I'm an intern, but I'm a student at the University of Pennsylvania. in terms of affiliation. And my question is open to all of you, whoever wants to answer, but it deals mainly with Turkey's relationship with Israel and how all the events that we've talked about so far here, the fight against extremism, all the different topics, how that relates to what you guys predict for the future of those relations. They obviously deteriorated after the flotilla raid in 2010, and only just recently have the prime ministers spoken with one another and asked to resume diplomatic relations, but as of yet ambassadors haven't been called yet. So I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on the future of those relations and how it ties into all the various topics we've talked about already.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ambassador Pearson, would you like to take that one?
Sure. I think that the two countries will achieve diplomatic relations, normalize them within a certain period of time, perhaps either as an added weight in the presidential campaign in Turkey before August, or as an announcement after that election is held to show the magnanimity of Turkey's approach to Israel during this dispute. But I would not expect there to be a significant warming of the relationship thereafter. There are significant differences between Turkey and Israel which need to be resolved, but which will probably only be resolved over time. That corner of geography, the northwest Middle East, is the most volatile piece of geography in the world today. And so the importance of Israel and Turkey being able to talk to each other and address these issues constructively couldn't be more important than it is right now.
And Şaban, I think you wanted to say something as well?
Yeah, I also agree. Over time there might be normalization, but not really warming up. But right now, as we stand, I think the ball is in the Israeli court. They are expected to move, and this is what the Prime Minister Erdogan also said to one American congressional delegation visiting Turkey last month. So, I mean, the talks are underway, but Netanyahu is having a hard time proceeding on both fronts, the peace talks and normalization with Turkey, and they have to come forward now. We were expecting for the municipal elections result, and there might be some progress, but now the Turkish presidential elections are approaching, but the move has to come from the Israeli side as the things stand.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
This is a question for Ambassador Ford regarding Syria. The Assad government just retook Latakia province, which includes the Armenian town of Kasab, what has been described as the last Armenian town in the Middle East, and Aleppo continues to be ground zero with Armenians again caught in the crosshairs. It is common knowledge that Turkey assisted the terrorists to enter Latakia and take Kasab, only to designate the group as a terrorist organization months later. What lessons have the Turkish government learned in their support of the extremist groups, and can we expect them to learn from this? Sorry for my mispronunciation of words.
Thank you for the question. Ambassador Ford?
Syrian forces just retook Kasab yesterday, I believe. And I'm sure that there was some element of Turkish complicity in terms of allowing people to move around the border in order for them to launch the multi-directional attack on Kasab some months ago. You mentioned Aleppo, and that fight's been going on for a year and a half, and something like 4 million Syrians have been affected there, including the Armenian community, but not limited to the Armenian community. And you asked what lessons the Turks have drawn, and I would say, I think, two things. Number one, I think there is a better understanding now among our Turkish friends of the problem of extremism in Syria, but it's a really deeply rooted problem, and it isn't going to be fixed in a day or two. And the second thing, which I believe the Turks have learned out of all of this, is that Assad is quite deeply entrenched, and unless there is more help to the moderate opposition, it's going to be really hard to get any kind of a political deal. I don't see any change. I'd be interested if Professor Kardash does, but I don't see yet any sign that the Turks are actually changing their stance on leaving Assad in place. My understanding is that the Turks still believe there needs to be a new government set up with or without Assad, but done through negotiation.
Thank you very much. Take a question from this side of the room, please.
Yes. My name is Hassan. I was born in Tehran. With the recent events that is happening in that part of the world, which the ambassadors also pointed out to be very volatile, and America has been trying for so long to try to be an honest broker. With events that we see right now as this moment, it seems to me that the U.S. is running out of carrots and sticks to use to be able to be effective there. Therefore, they're looking for some local, regional powers that they can pick up the banner and then calm down that situation. My question is to the ambassadors, which country do they think that can do this work?
Ambassador Ford, Ambassador Pearson. And perhaps, Judith, you also want to weigh in because you had something to say about how you can't always blame the US for everything.
Maybe you should go first.
Judith.
In any case, I think that the ability of the United States to affect the outcome of issues in the Middle East is still the largest single factor in the calculation of what to do in the region. I have a lot of sympathy for President Obama. The American people have told him to get out of Afghanistan, to get out of Iraq, to get out of Libya, and to get out of the Middle East. And he is trying to balance the reality of the need for an American presence and American action with public opinion that is running strongly against him. He will be blamed for every single choice he makes by somebody. But the important part of this equation is that the United States has the ability to talk to anyone and see if there is a solution. If talking to the Iranians is useful, why not talk to the Iranians? Yes, it gives them leverage, but it also gives them responsibility. Iran is the first nation to come, I will say, out into the open as a player now. It always had been a proxy player. Now it comes out into the open. Next probably will be the Saudis. They will come out from being a proxy player to being an open player because some of those bad guys up there paid with Saudi money. So the ability of the United States to help manage that is still the greatest single factor in a successful outcome. It is unfortunate that we are 2 or 3 years too late, but it still is a fact if you're looking forward. So thank you.
Judith?
It's a great question, and I think to a great extent Iran is really the only government that can have any leverage at this point. And the United States has leverage, but it doesn't have the ability really, without troops on the ground, one can question that. Now, Obama's made very clear he does not want to there will be no troops on the ground, but there are other forms of cooperation. And the Iranians are there, and they have been, and whether we like it or not, they're going to continue to be there. But if you need to get changes, if you need to find someone who can bring pressure on Maliki, we want preconditions on Maliki, for example. Before we'll give you aid, you have to promise to 1, 2, and 3. But it's really only the Iranians who can add their voice to that and have an impact. There's nobody else who can do that. And in that sense, I think that there are possibilities for limited cooperation, but you have to go into it with the idea that you're not going to change Iranian overall policy. For the Iranians, they've defined very clearly that Iraq is in their strategic interest. Iraq in the form it has, Iraq with a government that is compliant. Doesn't matter if it's Maliki to them, I don't think, but they will have a government that will protect and follow their interests and that they can feel secure with and not feel threatened by. Well, if we can live with that, and we probably can, we also would like a government that's not going to threaten anybody, that there may be ways, without, everyone sending in what a united, don't look for military force to do it, but there are ways to have leverage to get some of the things you want, but we're not going to be able to do it all by ourselves.
And Ambassador Ford, is there then an interesting equation there to look at? Does the US cooperate with Iran on stemming back the flow of ISIS towards Baghdad, and in exchange they get a nuclear deal and they compromise on Assad's future?
I think there's a strong desire here in Washington to have the nuclear deal stand on its own merits. I don't think they want to tie that to anything in the region.
What about Assad's future?
No, if you just let me intrude here, Iran has deliberately kept these issues separate. We have as well, and I think that will continue.
Great. One last question over there, please.
Hi, my name is Melissa Crawford, and I'm a Ringel Fellow currently working with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And it might surprise some people to know, but Turkey is the world's 4th largest donor in humanitarian aid, behind the United States, the EU, and the UK. And this aid isn't especially located just in Syria, but it's given to Pakistan, Lebanon, especially Somalia and other nations in Africa with a significant Muslim population. And assuming that the $3.3 billion Ankara has spent in aid isn't entirely altruistic, what do you believe are Turkey's goals or overall strategy with this aid?
Okay, thank you. We're running out of time, but we'll group it with the last question, and then I'll distribute.
Rahim Rashidi from Kurdistan TV. My question is for Ambassador Ford and Mr. Kardash. Hussein Chelik from AK Party said KRG have the right to their independence. What is your opinion of this message? Thank you.
Şaban, if you could start by addressing the question about aid and Turkey's motivations.
Yeah, just let me, about Iran, I share our assessment with Turkey as well. During the visit, I mean, they say we have to fight over radicalism, but they want to keep the Assad staying in power issue standalone, so they want to separate it. About the development aid, I mean, there should not be confusion about the numbers. I mean, as of 2011, I guess it was there when we, for the first time, spent more than $1 billion US dollars for development aid, and this has been ongoing. This is one of the flourishing parts of Turkish foreign policy. And it has been based on mixed motivations. Of course, like other traditional donors, Turkey has this sort of globalist reasons to do so, but like many other rising donors, there is this literature as well. The new actors such as Korea, they are also rising donors. Turkey can also be put in that category. But more specifically, it is shaped by Turkey's foreign policy to a large extent. The receivers of Turkey's development aid are mostly, when it started over time, of course, it evolved, starting from Central Asia, Balkans, later Afghanistan, and in recent years, African countries. So there's definitely some match between the evolution of Turkish foreign policy and development assistance. But the number you referred to, this is only the money spent, the $3 billion US dollars. This is only the money spent for the Syrian refugees. It should not be conflated with the development aid. This is a different story. And about Mr. Chelik's statements, I don't know what to say because I didn't read it. I don't know in what context he said it. But my own position on the Kurds in Iraq, I'm actually on Friday before departing Ankara with the workshop at my institution, and we had researchers from different groups in Iraq representing all factions, including the Kurds. And I was in the region for several times this year in the north and in Mosul as well. I mean, they have this desire to go alone, and I think there is a risk of opportunistic behavior here, especially as was mentioned in the case of Kirkuk. So if they move in the direction of turning this temporary situation into a permanent gain by A, declaring independence, or B, claiming or consolidating their claims over the disputed territories, they are going to undermine Iraq even further, and they will also get destabilized. So the current stability in the north is not, I think, very solid. They also have to recognize that they should not be misled by this appearance of stability.
Ambassador Ford, do you want to give us your last thoughts on the Kurdish question?
One of the things that most strikes me about Turkish policy in the last 5 years is the 180-degree turn that Ankara has had with the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq. It was, when I was at the American Embassy, it was extremely antagonistic, very difficult. I can remember making visits up to Iraqi Kurdistan, up to Salahuddin to meet President Barzani, and the Turks on numerous occasions either were or had just engaged in shelling. And so I think one of the first things for people to keep in mind is the relations with the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, I think, first revolve around security. They do not, the Turks very reasonably do not want PKK fighters to assemble in Kurdish-held areas of northern Iraq and then go in to Turkey proper and conduct ambushes of Turkish security personnel, which has happened regularly over the past years. I think they have a sense that Barzani now is committed to do more on that. Then there's the energy angle, which is relatively newer in the last couple of years, newer than the security issues, and that is a relationship which both sides, Kurdish and Turks, have an interest in. And I think the Turks finally are very aware of the regional angle there, which includes but is not limited to Iran, as well as Arab states, which will have their own views about the dismemberment of an Arab sovereign nation. So I'm not quite sure what Mr. Celli said, but I'm sure that although the Turks may see some angles here, I think they're also going to see lots of areas where they're going to need to be cautious.
We have to wrap up, but Judith, you have 30 seconds for your last thought.
Very brief, that the risk of opportunistic behavior that my colleague mentioned is exactly the point I made earlier, that the Kurds' behavior, especially in taking over the disputed territories, it simply is laying the groundwork for future warfare and for bringing the Arabs at some point together, because that is the red flag, or whatever you want to call it, for them. And the other thing is that Barzani has not kept many of his promises to the Turks, including prior commitments to do something about the PKK, and the fact that he is unpopular with the Syrian Kurds and not too popular, I think, with the...
They are quite nationalistic people, and it is the Prime Minister who had convinced them that the Kurdish issue should be solved, and the Kurds should have been given more rights. But a few years ago, those people, those electorates in the, for example, Black Sea region, would go against it. But the Prime Minister is able to convince them. So Recep Tayyip Erdogan is the best chance for the Kurdish people to gain something from him, from his personality. Perhaps he might sound, or he might appear to be like a dictator or authoritarian personality, but because of his charismatic leadership, he is able to convince people. That should not be forgotten.
All right, thank you.
We are not forgetting that.
Mr. Yüksel, please try to answer that shortly.
But I only want to say one thing about the military base. Okay, let's go and do a referendum in Liege, where 3 people dies, but because the military, they shoot on the population. Let's do a referendum there, if they want a military base there or not. I'm sure they will be in Liege. 3 civil people.
Huh? How they were fighting? There was very violent demonstrations and clash with the policemen, and people are dying, of course. I'm sorry, guys, but we need to wrap this up.
95%
all right,
or 99% that
thank you, Mr. Yüksel. Thank you all for participating in this great panel, and I'd like to thank the audience for being patient with us. Thank you.
Visit our website and become a member, and thank you all for coming.